Most people know Cain, possibly the world's first murderer, at least according to biblical history. This character, driven by jealousy and resentment towards his younger brother Abel, lured him into the fields and killed him. The narrative leads us to believe that, with Abel's death, only 3 people remained on earth: Cain, his father Adam, and his mother Eve. Therefore, there wasn't much speculation about who committed the crime, the so-called smoking gun, or in this case, the smoking stone. God in the biblical narrative is depicted as very active at that time, and already knew that Cain was the murderer, condemning him to wander endlessly. The idea of someone wandering the earth eternally is a fascinating and provocative concept, especially for someone like Cain, literally capable of murder. This perpetual wandering has been the subject of scrutiny by readers and scholars, who debate whether Cain also received eternal existence, whether he was still around after the events of Genesis, and perhaps whether he still roams the earth today. In this episode, we will explore both sides of the argument and present some of the most extravagant and controversial ideas that have emerged about Cain's supposed immortality. It is important to understand the Genesis narrative, which tells us exactly the extent of Cain's punishment. When God finds the body of Abel and accuses Cain of being the guilty party, he says, "Now you are cursed and banished from the soil that opened its mouth to receive the blood of your brother from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Upon hearing this, Cain laments that this is a punishment greater than he can bear, and points out the injustice of being driven from his home, and that anyone who found him could kill him. To prevent this, God tells him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7-fold. Then the Lord placed a mark on Cain, so that no one who found him would kill him. Beyond that, we do not know what happened to Cain, as the Bible relegates him to obscurity shortly after this passage. We know that his wandering led him to the land of Nod, which was east of Eden, and later we are told that Cain found a wife and had a son named Enoch, before dedicating himself to building a city also called Enoch. It is here that scholars agree that Cain's wandering came to an end. It is possible that, after forming a family and starting a city, Cain naturally settled down, and although still immortal to death by human hands due to the mark, he would still be subject to aging, which naturally caught up with him. There is also the possibility of accidental death, something explored in the Book of Jubilees, where Cain's death may have been caused by some natural calamity or misfortune. Another argument suggests that, due to the time elapsed between the murder of his brother and the beginning of his family, Cain changed and repented of his sin. With this, God allowed him to settle down and, over time, remove the mark, freeing him from any immortality. These ideas coincide with the conclusion that Cain is probably no longer among us, but rather that he either expired naturally or suffered some other fatality that the biblical narrative deemed irrelevant to include. A stronger argument against Cain's existence and survival over time is simply the biblical flood, as told in Genesis chapter 6. The flood wiped out everything, all the animals of the sky, the earth, and all the people who, at that time, were considered wicked and beyond salvation. Only Noah and his family were chosen to survive, and only the creatures that were on the ark were spared from being drowned. As the biblical narrative does not mention Cain here, it is reasonable to believe that, if he was around at that time, he would have perished. On the other hand, there are those who believe in the theory that Cain is still out there, since the Bible never specifies that anyone killed him or that he came to an end. It is important to note that many confuse the mark that God placed on Cain with immortality. Indeed, one could argue that Cain became invulnerable to murder, or that, at least, no one dared to try after seeing the mark, but there is nothing to suggest that he was invulnerable to everything else. Still, the theory that Cain still roams the earth persists, and some of the arguments can be quite creative. One argument suggests that, after killing Abel and wandering to the land of Nod, Cain continued to roam until building the city of Enoch. After that, he resumed his wandering before disappearing into obscurity, where he either changed his identity or became so reclusive that no one else found him. This could be a possible explanation, but it still does not overcome the hurdle of the flood. How could Cain have survived the flood, which was specifically designed to eliminate people like him? Well, to answer that, proponents of this theory turn again to the mark and suggest that the mark provided Cain with an ironic protection, allowing him to survive the flood and continue to wander in this new world, where even fewer people would remember him. For those who take this narrative literally, there is the idea that Cain's existence persisted well beyond the pages of the Old Testament, to the point that he is still out there somewhere. Of course, with this conception, we would have to rationalize that the characters depicted here were really real, and that the events of the biblical text were historical. Through this, some believers have determined that Cain could be some kind of homeless person or wanderer, someone constantly on the move and cursed to a life of begging and hardship. Advocates of such a theory aim to use the exact terminology of God's curse to reinforce this idea. When Cain worked the land, it would not yield crops. Ergo, when Cain tried to acquire sustenance or attempt to improve his condition, it would be in vain. Assuming that this theory were correct, the guise of Cain as a homeless person or wanderer in the modern era would not be implausible if God's curse really prevented him from acquiring crops, food, money, or any of the basic necessities of life. Alternatively, another theory is that Cain is exactly the opposite. He is one of the elite, if not the secret ruler of the world. If we think about how long he would have been alive, it is possible that Cain has acquired more skills and talents than anyone else who has ever existed. He would have had literally millennia to learn about human psychology, strategy, warfare, self-defense, and who knows, perhaps even some form of ancient and dark magic. With a creature that, according to this theory, cannot die, it is not difficult to imagine that he has climbed to the top of the world hierarchy in the first few thousand years and maintained his position since then. In a more dynamic theory, some groups believe that Cain is Sasquatch or Bigfoot, living isolated from humanity among nature's caves. In the Book of Jasher, a 17th century Hebrew book that provides readers with additional, sometimes controversial concepts, we are presented with a version that solidifies Cain's death. In this story, long after Cain's exile, the biblical character Lamech, who was blind, went out hunting with his son, whose name was Canaan. During the hunt, Canaan was frightened by the form of something on the horizon and instructed his father to shoot. Lamech, who was blind, hit the target, which happened to be the heart of Cain. Here, Cain dies from the wound, which also suggests that the mark did not make him invulnerable to murder, but could have been a strong warning to all who saw him that killing him would be imprudent. After all, God had told Cain that whoever killed him would suffer vengeance sevenfold. Therefore, it is likely that anyone who saw Cain simply kept their distance instead of actively trying to kill him. Another theory from the Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish apocryphal text, tells us that Cain was killed when his house collapsed on him. According to this narrative, Cain met divine karma in this instance, as it was with a stone that he killed his brother Abel, and it was with a stone that he himself was killed. We are informed that with a stone he killed Abel, and by a stone he was killed in just judgment. The idea of Cain still roaming the earth is intriguing, regardless of which side you may find yourself on. The scriptures mostly suggest that Cain's life is inconclusive. We are never informed about his death, and thus his fate is left to interpretation. The idea of Cain's perpetual wandering remains a fascinating topic for theological discussion, reflecting on deeper questions about sin, punishment, and divine justice. But tell me your opinions on the theories we discussed today, and whether you believe Cain found rest at some point in Genesis, or if it is possible that he is still out there. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more content like this. Until next time.